The wine glass shattered against the wall behind my head, red liquid dripping down the cream-colored paint like blood. I sat frozen at the dining table, my left hand still extended where I'd shown them the ring. The modest sapphire caught the chandelier light, a tiny beacon of hope in a room that had suddenly turned violent. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. David Brennan stood over me, his face purple with rage, fists still clenched from where he'd swept the entire table setting onto the floor. Shards of his precious imported china littered the marble tile. My mother pressed herself into the corner, eyes wide with that familiar terror I'd seen too many times. Tyler, my stepbrother, sat motionless with his phone halfway to his ear, frozen mid-text. That's what he got you? David's voice dripped with contempt. That pathetic excuse for a ring? I spend more on cufflinks. I should have stayed quiet. I should have known better than to share my joy with these people. But something in his tone, the way he reduced the most precious thing in my life to a price tag, made me speak. It was James's grandmother's ring. It means something. The slap came so fast I didn't see his hand move. My head snapped to the side, the copper taste of blood filling my mouth. The sapphire blurred through sudden tears, but I didn't look away from it. I wouldn't give him that satisfaction. Sentimental garbage, he hissed, grabbing my wrist and yanking it closer to examine the ring. This is what happens when you date down, Rachel. Some software monkey who can't even afford a proper diamond. You're embarrassing this family. My name is Rachel Morrison, and I'm a senior tax attorney with the IRS Criminal Investigation Division. I've spent the last 8 years building cases against millionaires who think they're too clever to pay their taxes. I've traced money through shell companies in the Caymans, uncovered structured deposits designed to avoid reporting requirements, and testified in federal court against men who thought their wealth made them untouchable. But none of that mattered as David Brennan towered over me in his gaudy McMansion, surrounded by the trappings of success he'd built on a foundation I was only beginning to understand was completely fraudulent. He released my wrist with a shove that sent me back against my chair. Get out of my house. Come back when you found someone worthy of the Brennan name. I stood slowly, carefully, like I was dealing with an aggressive animal. Because that's what he was. A predator who'd married into our lives when I was already away at college, who'd systematically isolated my mother, elevated his golden child Tyler, and treated me like an inconvenient reminder that Patricia had a life before him. This isn't your house, David. The words came out steady despite my shaking hands. It's in Mom's name. Her inheritance from my father paid for it. His eyes narrowed. Community property, sweetheart. You'd know that if you were any good at your fancy lawyer job. I grabbed my purse and headed for the door. Behind me, I heard my mother's soft crying, Tyler's nervous laughter, David's satisfied grunt as he poured himself another scotch. The castle was secure. The kingdom undisturbed. They had no idea what they'd just set in motion. The drive back to San Francisco took 6 hours, but I barely noticed the miles disappearing beneath my tires. My hands gripped the steering wheel with white-knuckled intensity, my mind racing through everything I'd observed during my brief visit to Riverside. The visit that was supposed to be a joyful announcement of my engagement to James, the man who made me laugh, who valued substance over status, who worked in clean energy technology because he wanted to make a difference, not a fortune. Instead, it had turned into another reminder of why I'd left that house the moment I could, why I'd worked 3 jobs to pay for law school rather than accept David's conditional support, why I'd chosen the unglamorous work of tax law over the corporate partnerships he insisted were the only respectable career path. My phone rang through the car speakers. James. I answered on the second ring. Hey, how did it go? Are they excited about the wedding? I touched my still-swollen cheek gently. It went about as well as expected. Silence. James knew my family dynamics. We'd been together for 3 years, and he'd witnessed enough holiday disasters to understand the code in my voice. Rachel, what happened? He didn't like the ring. Said you weren't good enough for the Brennan name. I tried to keep my voice light, but it cracked on the last word. I'm going to drive down there. James's voice hardened in a way I rarely heard. I'm going to have a conversation with your stepfather about respect. No. The word came out sharper than I intended. James, I need you to trust me on this. David Brennan is about to learn a very expensive lesson about who he chose to disrespect. What are you planning? I merged onto Interstate 5, the lights of Riverside disappearing in my rearview mirror. Nothing illegal. Just a very thorough review of some documentation I happened to notice during dinner. Because that's what David didn't understand in his alcohol-fueled rage. I wasn't just Rachel, the daughter who'd escaped to San Francisco. I was Rachel Morrison, the woman who noticed things. Who'd spent the evening before his explosion observing the details of his supposed success. The filing cabinets in his home office that he'd left open while fetching more wine. The stack of bank statements on the kitchen counter. The multiple phones he juggled throughout dinner. The nervous glance he'd exchanged with Tyler when I mentioned my recent promotion to lead investigator for the Northern California division. And most importantly, the folder I'd accidentally knocked over while reaching for the breadbasket. The folder labeled Brennan Properties LLC, with documents inside that had a very familiar name listed as registered agent, Rachel Morrison. My name. On business documents for companies I'd never heard of. Documents that would make me legally responsible for any financial irregularities those companies might have committed. Rachel, you're scaring me a little. I smiled, the expression feeling strange on my bruised face. Don't be scared. Be excited. Your future mother-in-law is about to get the house back. The one my father's life insurance actually paid for. I don't understand. You will. I need to make some calls tomorrow. Run some database searches. Review some property records. David's been very busy building his real estate empire, and I have a feeling he's been very creative with his tax reporting. James was quiet for a moment. This is about more than the ring, isn't it? The ring was just the catalyst. This is about justice. This is about my mother, who hasn't smiled genuinely in 8 years. This is about my father's memory, which David treats like an inconvenient footnote. This is about every woman who's been told her worth is measured by the size of her diamond rather than the strength of her character. I paused, taking the exit that would lead me back to my apartment, my real life, my world where competence mattered more than connections. David Brennan thinks wealth means power. He's about to discover that knowledge is the only real currency that matters. And I have access to databases he doesn't even know exist. After hanging up with James, I drove through the dark streets of San Francisco, my mind already organizing the investigation I'd launch tomorrow. The IRS Criminal Investigation Division had given me tools that most people didn't understand existed. We could trace financial transactions through layers of corporate structures. We could identify patterns of behavior that suggested tax evasion. We could connect dots that criminals thought they'd successfully hidden. And I'd just spent an evening in David Brennan's home, eating dinner at a table surrounded by evidence of financial crimes, bearing my name on documents I'd never signed, wearing a ring he'd deemed worthless while sitting in a house purchased with my dead father's money. He'd hit me for the last time. Not because I feared him, but because after tomorrow, he'd have much bigger problems than an ungrateful stepdaughter who chose love over luxury. I pulled into my building's parking garage and sat for a moment, looking at the ring on my finger. James had proposed on a hiking trail overlooking the Pacific, no fancy restaurant, no staged photographer, just him and me and a promise to build something real together. The sapphire had belonged to his grandmother, a woman who'd immigrated from Taiwan with nothing and built a life through hard work and integrity. David had called it garbage. He'd called James unworthy. He'd physically attacked me for defending the man I loved. Tomorrow, I'd show him what real value looked like. And it had nothing to do with the size of a diamond or the price of a suit. It had everything to do with documentation, evidence, and the patient application of federal tax law. I touched my cheek one more time, feeling the tender swelling. Physical evidence. I'd photograph it tonight, document it tomorrow. Because in my line of work, evidence was everything. David Brennan had just made the mistake of his life. He'd assaulted a federal agent. He'd forged my signature on corporate documents. He'd built an empire on what I suspected was systematic tax fraud. And now he'd given me both the motivation and the justification to look very, very carefully at every financial decision he'd made over the past decade. The sapphire caught the parking garage lights as I locked my car. Small, meaningful, real. Everything David's world of appearances and fraud wasn't. Monday morning arrived with the kind of clarity that only comes after a sleepless night spent planning. I sat at my kitchen table at 5 in the morning, laptop open, coffee growing cold beside me, staring at the photograph I'd taken of my bruised cheek. The purple had deepened overnight, spreading across my cheekbone in an ugly bloom that makeup wouldn't hide. I uploaded it to my secure cloud storage, time-stamped and geotagged. Evidence began with documentation. James had left early for a product launch meeting, but not before gently touching my face and asking one more time if I wanted to file a police report. I'd kissed him and said no. Assault charges would be satisfying but limited. What I had in mind would be far more comprehensive. Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel, it means a lot to us. Now back to the story. I opened my work laptop and logged into the IRS criminal investigation database, the same system I used to track down millionaires who thought offshore accounts made them invisible. My credentials gave me access to financial records that most people didn't know the government could see. Bank transfers, property transactions, business filings, tax returns going back decades. The digital footprint of money was nearly impossible to erase completely, and people like David always left trails because they genuinely believed they were smarter than the system. I started with the basics. David Brennan, Riverside, California. His personal tax returns populated first. He reported income from Brennan Property Management, a sole proprietorship. $58,000 last year. Modest. Almost suspiciously modest for a man who drove a Range Rover, lived in a gated community, and wore a Rolex that cost more than most people's cars. I pulled his property holdings next. The house where my mother lived was indeed in her name, Patricia Morrison Brennan, purchased 9 years ago for $700,000. My father's life insurance and military death benefits had totaled $680,000. The down payment matched perfectly. But the deed showed a refinance 2 years later, pulling out $200,000 in equity. That money had supposedly gone into David's business expansion. I cross-referenced the business entities registered in Riverside County. Brennan Property Management LLC. Brennan Holdings LLC. Brennan Investment Group LLC. Riverside Development Partners LLC. Golden State Property Solutions LLC. 6 different companies, and there, all registered on every single registered agent line, was a name that made my coffee suddenly taste like acid, Rachel Morrison. My hands trembled as I pulled up the formation documents. Each one bore a signature that looked remarkably like mine but wasn't. The loops were wrong, the pressure uneven. Someone had practiced copying my signature, probably from old birthday cards or the few documents I'd signed when visiting home. They'd used my name, my address from 4 years ago when I'd lived in Sacramento during my first assignment, my bar number. They'd made me the legal face of David's empire. If any of these companies had committed financial crimes, would appear to be involved. My professional reputation, my security clearance, my entire career could evaporate because my stepfather needed a legitimate-looking front for whatever schemes he was running. I pulled the tax returns for each LLC. Brennan Property Management showed consistent small losses, just enough to offset David's personal income. Standard small business stuff. But the other 5 companies showed something fascinating. Rental income reported on Schedule E forms, but the amounts were strangely consistent. $19,000 per company per year. Just under the threshold that would trigger additional reporting requirements. I opened a new spreadsheet and started mapping the properties these companies claimed to own. Riverside Development Partners owned 3 rental properties according to their tax return, generating $19,000 in annual rental income. I pulled the property records for each address. 2 were vacant lots. 1 was a gas station. None of them were residential rentals. My pulse quickened. This was it. This was the thread that, when pulled, would unravel everything. I spent the next 3 hours diving deeper. Golden State Property Solutions claimed to own apartment buildings, but the addresses corresponded to commercial warehouses. Brennan Holdings reported rental income from properties that had been demolished 5 years ago. Every single company was reporting just enough income to look legitimate, just under the thresholds that would trigger audits, but none of it corresponded to actual rental properties. It was a classic money laundering scheme. David was taking cash from somewhere, probably his actual rental properties or something worse, and filtering it through these shell companies to make it look like legitimate rental income. The small, consistent amounts were designed to fly under the radar. And by using my name as the registered agent, he'd created a buffer between himself and any potential investigation. If the IRS came looking, they'd find Rachel Morrison, tax attorney, appearing to be complicit in systematic fraud. My career would be over before I could prove I'd never signed those documents. But David had made one critical mistake. He'd victimized someone who knew exactly how these schemes worked and had the tools to prove it. I picked up my phone and called my supervisor, Marcus Chin, a 20-year veteran of CI who'd mentored me since my first assignment. He answered on the second ring. "Rachel, it's not even 8 yet. This better be good. Marcus, I need to report a conflict of interest and request a case reassignment." Silence. Then, carefully, "Go on. My name has been used without authorization as registered agent for multiple business entities in Riverside County. These entities appear to be engaged in systematic tax fraud. One of the principals is my stepfather." More silence. I heard papers rustling, the click of a keyboard. Marcus was already taking notes. "You're certain you didn't sign these documents?" "I'll submit handwriting analysis, but yes. I'm certain. I discovered them during a family visit this weekend." "What prompted you to look?" I touched my cheek, the swelling tender under my fingers. "He assaulted me at dinner." I started wondering what else he was capable of. "Jesus, Rachel. Are you okay?" "I have photographs. Witnesses. But that's not why I'm calling. I'm calling because someone has committed identity theft, forgery, and what appears to be systematic tax fraud using my credentials. I need this investigated by someone without my personal involvement." "Understood. Send me everything you have. I'll assign it to Jennifer Park's team. She's our best on structured fraud cases." He paused. "Rachel, if this goes where I think it's going, your stepfather is looking at serious prison time." "I know. And you're okay with that?" I thought about my mother's fearful eyes, the way she'd pressed herself into the corner while David raged. I thought about my father's insurance money, meant to give us security, instead leveraged to fund criminal enterprises. I thought about the ring on my finger and the man who'd given it to me, who valued integrity over appearance. I'm not okay with what he did, Marcus. I'm not okay with him using my name to commit crimes. I'm not okay with him stealing from my mother. What happens next is just law enforcement doing its job. Fair enough. Get me those documents within the hour. And Rachel, take a few days off. This is going to get complicated. After hanging up, I compiled everything into a secure file. The forged signatures. The property mismatches. The structured income designed to avoid reporting thresholds. The timeline showing when each company was formed and how it corresponded to my mother's refinanced home equity. Every piece of evidence that would show David Brennan had built his lifestyle on fraud and done it using his stepdaughter's stolen identity. I hit send and leaned back in my chair, exhausted despite the early hour. My phone buzzed. A text from my mother. "Rachel, please call me. David is very upset about last night. He didn't mean to lose his temper. Can we talk?" I stared at the message for a long time. Part of me wanted to call her, to warn her what was coming. But another part, the part that had spent 8 years learning how criminals operated, knew that warning her would be warning David. She'd tell him, whether she meant to or not, and he'd have time to destroy evidence, move money, create false documentation. I typed back a simple response. "I need some space right now, Mom. I'll call you when I'm ready." Her reply came immediately. He wants to apologize. He's willing to help pay for the wedding if you give him another chance. Of course he was. Because David had spent the night thinking about what he'd done, realizing he'd attacked a federal agent, and was now trying to buy his way out of consequences. 50,000 for the wedding. Maybe 100. Whatever it took to make the problem go away. But some problems couldn't be bought. Some doors, once opened, couldn't be closed. I turned off my phone and spent the rest of the morning reviewing case law on identity theft and tax fraud. By noon, Jennifer Park had called to confirm she was taking the case. By 2, she'd requested search warrants for David's financial records. By 4, the warrants had been approved by a federal magistrate based on the evidence of forged documents and structured fraud. David Brennan was about to have a very bad week. And he still had no idea it was coming. He probably thought he'd gotten away with his temper tantrum, that maybe he'd have to grovel a little and write a check, but nothing serious. Men like him always thought that. They lived in a world where money fixed problems and violence established dominance. They never expected the quiet woman they dismissed to have the power to dismantle their entire existence with properly filed paperwork and federal subpoenas. I made myself dinner, something simple, and sat by the window watching the San Francisco fog roll in. James came home around 7, immediately pulling me into a gentle hug, careful of my bruised face. "How was your day?" "Productive," I said. "Very productive." "Should I be worried?" "Not unless you've been committing tax fraud." He laughed, but there was concern in his eyes. "Rachel, what did you do?" "My job. I reported crimes that I discovered. Federal agents are now investigating those crimes. That's all." I showed him the ring, the sapphire catching the lamplight. He called this garbage. "Called you unworthy. Hit me for defending it." James took my hand, studying the ring on my finger. It was my grandmother's most precious possession. She worked 3 jobs to send my father to college. This ring represented every sacrifice she made for family. I know. That's why it matters. That's why what happens next matters. David measures worth in dollars. He's about to learn that actual value comes from integrity, from honesty, from following the rules everyone else has to follow. When will things start happening? Soon. Maybe tomorrow. Maybe next week. Federal investigations move at their own pace. I leaned against him, feeling the tension of the day finally catching up. But they move thoroughly. Every transaction, every document, every lie he's told. They'll find it all. We stood there in the gathering darkness, the fog obscuring the city lights, and I felt something settle inside me. Not revenge. Not even satisfaction yet. Just the quiet certainty that justice, real justice, was in motion. Slow, methodical, inevitable. David had thrown a wine glass at my head for showing him a ring he deemed inadequate. In response, I'd shown federal investigators a financial empire built on fraud. The responses were proportional in their own way. He'd used violence. I'd used documentation. His weapon was temporary rage. Mine was permanent consequences. Tomorrow, I'd go back to work. I'd handle my regular cases, review my other investigations, maintain my professional distance from the David Brennan matter. Jennifer would build the case brick by brick, subpoena by subpoena, until the structure was so solid that even the most expensive defense attorney couldn't knock it down. And David would wake up one morning soon to federal agents at his door, just like the dozens of other criminals I'd helped put away. He'd protest his innocence, claim persecution, try to use his connections and his money to make it disappear. But tax fraud didn't care about connections. Numbers didn't lie, and I'd built my entire career on following numbers to their inevitable conclusions. James kissed the top of my head. "I love you. And not because you're terrifying when someone crosses you, though that's definitely a bonus." I smiled, the first genuine smile since the dinner disaster. "I love you too. Even though your grandmother's ring caused all this trouble." The ring didn't cause anything. It just revealed what was already there. He was right. The ring had simply been the catalyst, the moment when David's control was challenged and his true nature emerged. But his crimes had existed long before I showed up with a sapphire on my finger. I just finally looked close enough to see them. The call came on Wednesday morning while I was reviewing a case involving a dentist who'd forgotten to report $500,000 in cash payments. Jennifer Park's number flashed on my screen. "Rachel, we executed the warrants this morning. You need to hear this." I set down my coffee, pulse quickening despite my attempt to stay professionally detached. "Go ahead." "Your stepfather's office was a treasure trove. We found ledgers, actual handwritten ledgers, tracking cash payments that never appeared on any tax returns. He's been running a side business renting properties to undocumented workers, all cash, no paper trail except for his own meticulous record keeping. The man documented his own crimes." I closed my eyes, not sure whether to laugh or cry at the stupidity. "How much?" "Preliminary count suggests unreported income of roughly $200,000 per year for the past 6 years. That's $1.2 million in tax evasion before we even factor in the shell company fraud." Jennifer's voice held a note of satisfaction. "But here's the really interesting part. We found a safety deposit box key. Went to the bank with a warrant. Inside was $350,000 in cash and a file folder labeled insurance." "Insurance against what?" "Against you, apparently. He's been collecting information on your cases, your travel schedule, your personal life. Photos of you and James at restaurants. Copies of your performance reviews that he somehow obtained. A timeline of your career with notes about which cases you were working. It's borderline stalking." My stomach turned cold. He was building leverage. In case I ever became a problem. That's our assessment. The cash appears to be his escape fund. We're running serial numbers now, but I'd bet they trace back to his unreported rental income. He was preparing for the day someone caught on to his schemes. "Has he been arrested?" "Agents are at his house right now." Your mother answered the door. She seemed genuinely shocked. "Rachel." I don't think she knew about any of this. I thought about my mother, who'd spent 8 years slowly disappearing into David's shadow, who'd chosen financial security over personal integrity. Did she ask about me? She asked if you were safe. That was her first question. Then she asked what David had done. Something inside my chest loosened slightly. At least she'd thought of me first. What happens now? He'll be arraigned tomorrow morning. Federal courthouse in Riverside. The U.S. attorney is pushing for remand based on flight risk and the cash we found. His lawyer is already making noise about excessive prosecution, harassment, that you orchestrated this out of spite. He hit me. I reported crimes I discovered. Those are facts, not spite. I know. And the evidence speaks for itself. Forged signatures, structured fraud, money laundering, tax evasion. We have 12 years of documentation. His lawyer can scream persecution all he wants, but numbers don't lie. After hanging up, I sat motionless at my desk, staring at the city beyond my window. 12 years. David had been committing these crimes for 12 years, building his empire on fraud while presenting himself as a successful businessman. My mother had lived with a criminal and never suspected, or perhaps never wanted to know. My phone buzzed. Tyler, my stepbrother. I stared at his name for a long moment before answering. What the hell did you do? His voice shook with rage. The FBI showed up at the house this morning. They're tearing apart Dad's office. Mom is hysterical. Neighbors are watching. You vindictive witch, you did this because he called your ring cheap. He hit me, Tyler. And he's been committing federal crimes using my forged signature. Those are the reasons federal agents are at your house. You're lying. Dad would never forge anything. You probably signed those documents years ago and forgot. Handwriting analysis will prove otherwise. But Tyler, I need you to understand something. Your father has been running illegal rental operations, laundering money, and evading taxes for over a decade. The evidence is overwhelming. This has nothing to do with a ring or a dinner. This is about systematic criminal activity. He took care of us. He gave Mom a good life. He paid for everything. With stolen money. With unreported income. With fraud. That's not taking care of anyone, that's building a house of cards that was always going to collapse. I work for his company. What happens to me? There it was. The real fear beneath the anger. Tyler's entire adult life had been funded by his father's crimes. He'd never had to struggle, never had to wonder where rent money would come from, never had to work 3 jobs while going to school. He'd glided through life on a cushion of illegal cash. That depends on your involvement. If you knowingly participated in the fraud, you'll face charges. If you were unaware, you'll just lose your job when the assets are seized. Seized? What are you talking about? Criminal forfeiture. Everything your father bought with unreported income is subject to seizure. The cars, the properties, probably the house. Your mother will be protected to some extent, but Tyler, the life you knew is over. He was crying now, ugly gasping sobs. How can you do this to your own family? How could he hit me at dinner? How could he use my name to commit crimes? How could he steal from my mother? You want to talk about family, Tyler, let's talk about how your father treated the people who were supposed to matter. I hung up before he could respond. There was no point continuing the conversation. Tyler had chosen his father's side long ago, had benefited from that choice, and was now facing consequences he'd never imagined possible. My mother called an hour later. I almost didn't answer, but something made me pick up. Rachel. Her voice was small, broken. They say David has been breaking the law. They say he used your name. I don't understand any of this. Mom, did you know about the rental properties he never reported? What rental properties? He has the business, but it barely makes money. He's always complaining about expenses. He owns at least 15 rental properties that he's been operating under the table. All cash. No taxes. No reporting. He's been hiding over $1 million in income. Silence. Then, quietly, the house. They say they might take the house. They might. It was purchased partially with my father's insurance money, but it's been refinanced twice using equity built on unreported income. The courts will have to sort out what portion is legitimately yours. Where will I go? The question hung in the air. Where would she go at 56 years old, married to a criminal, about to lose everything? I thought about telling her she should have asked that question 8 years ago, before she let David erase my father from their lives. I thought about reminding her that she'd watched him hit me and said nothing. I thought about all the ways she'd chosen comfort over courage. Instead, I said, there's an apartment complex in Sacramento near where I used to live. Reasonable rent. I can help you with first and last month if you need it. But Mom, you have to understand something. I didn't do this to you. David did this. Every crime he committed, every dollar he hid, every lie he told, those were his choices. I just refused to be collateral damage. He said you were always difficult. Always thought you were better than us. I thought I was different from you. There's a distinction. I chose not to look the other way when someone broke the law. I chose not to accept violence as normal. I chose not to measure my worth by someone else's bank account. I took a breath. You can choose differently now, Mom. You can cooperate with investigators, tell them everything you know, make it clear you were deceived. Or you can stand by David and hope loyalty to a criminal impresses a federal judge. You're asking me to betray my husband. I'm asking you to tell the truth. There's a difference. She hung up without another word. I set down the phone and returned to my case files, the dentist with unreported income suddenly seeming like a pleasant distraction from family drama. James came home that evening with takeout from my favorite Thai place and a bottle of wine. He took one look at my face and set everything on the counter. Bad day? They executed the search warrants. Found everything. David's being arraigned tomorrow. He pulled me into his arms, and I let myself lean against him, feeling the weight of the past few days finally catching up. Tyler called. Then my mother. Both angry. Both blaming me. Of course they are. Taking responsibility would require admitting they enabled a criminal for years. My mother might lose the house. She's asking where she'll go. James was quiet for a moment, his hand gentle on my back. What do you want to do? Part of me wants to let her figure it out on her own. She made choices. She gets consequences. I pulled back to look at him. But she's still my mother. And under all the weakness and enabling, there's a woman who used to be strong. Who used to stand up for things. Before David. So you'll help her. I'll help her get an apartment. Help her start over. But I won't help her stay with David. I won't enable her the way she enabled him. I touched the ring on my finger, the sapphire that had started everything. Your grandmother left Taiwan with nothing. Built a whole life from scratch. If she could do that, my mother can survive losing a house bought with stolen money. We ate dinner quietly, the television playing news neither of us watched. My phone buzzed periodically with calls from numbers I didn't recognize. Reporters, probably, having gotten wind of the story. Federal agent Stepfather arrested in tax fraud case. The headlines would write themselves. Around 10, I received an email from Jennifer. David had been arraigned and remanded into custody. The judge had reviewed the evidence of hidden cash and flight risk, denied bail, and set a preliminary hearing for 3 weeks out. David Brennan, who'd ruled his household with violence and intimidation, was spending the night in federal detention. I should have felt satisfaction. Instead, I felt hollow. This wasn't victory. It was just the application of law to someone who'd broken it. There was no joy in watching someone's life collapse, even someone who'd hit me, even someone who'd committed crimes. There was only the quiet certainty that rules existed for reasons and consequences followed violations. James found me on the couch an hour later, staring at nothing. He sat beside me without speaking, just present, solid, real. Everything David's world of fraud and violence hadn't been. I keep thinking about the ledgers, I finally said. He wrote everything down. Every cash payment, every unreported dollar. Why would someone document their own crimes? Control. People like him need to know exactly what they have, what they've taken, what they've gotten away with. The documentation wasn't evidence to him. It was proof of his cleverness. Clever would have been paying his taxes and living honestly. Clever would have been not hitting a federal agent over a ring he didn't like. I laughed despite everything, the sound surprising me. That too. We sat in the darkness, the city lights blinking beyond the windows, and I thought about everything that had changed in less than a week. I'd gone home to share joy and been met with violence. I'd discovered crimes and reported them. I'd set in motion consequences that would destroy a family that was barely holding together anyway. The ring caught the lamplight, sapphire glowing softly. David had called it worthless. But it had revealed everything worth knowing. That love didn't require expensive displays. That integrity mattered more than appearance. That some people measured worth in dollars while others measured it in character. Tomorrow I'd return to work. I'd handle my cases, review my investigations, maintain professional distance from the David Brennan matter. Jennifer would build the prosecution brick by brick. The U.S. attorney would present evidence to a grand jury. David would hire expensive lawyers who'd try to find technicalities and loopholes in a case built on 12 years of documentation. And somewhere in Riverside, my mother would decide whether to tell the truth or maintain loyalty to a man who'd built their life on lies. Tyler would realize that the easy existence he'd enjoyed had always been temporary. The neighbors would gossip. The house would eventually be seized or sold. The carefully constructed facade of success would crumble completely. But here, in this apartment, with this man who'd given me his grandmother's ring and never once asked me to be anything other than exactly who I was, there was only truth. No fraud. No violence. No performance. Just two people building something real, one honest day at a time. I turned to James, took his face in my hands, and kissed him gently. Thank you. For what? For being worth defending. For making me want to be someone who values the right things. For giving me a ring your grandmother cherished and trusting me to understand what it meant. He smiled, that soft expression that made everything else fade away. She would have loved you. She always said the best things in life couldn't be bought, only earned through how you treated people. Your grandmother was a wise woman. She was. And she had excellent taste in sapphires. We sat together as the city settled into late-night quiet, two people who'd chosen substance over show, who'd built careers on integrity, who understood that real value had nothing to do with price tags or appearances. David had wanted to teach me a lesson about knowing my place. Instead, he'd learned that some people couldn't be intimidated into silence. That specialized knowledge was more powerful than physical threats. That documentation defeated deception every single time. The ring sparkled on my finger, modest and meaningful and absolutely perfect. Worth more than all of David's ill-gotten wealth combined, measured by the only currency that actually mattered. Truth. 3 weeks dissolved into a blur of work and waiting. I threw myself into my regular caseload, grateful for the distraction of other people's financial crimes. A restaurant owner who'd been skimming cash for years. A contractor who'd classified employees as independent contractors to avoid payroll taxes. A doctor who'd created fake charitable donations to inflate his deductions. Each case was straightforward, provable, uncomplicated by family ties or emotional weight. Jennifer kept me updated on the David Brennan investigation through brief, professional emails. The grand jury had indicted him on 42 counts. His attorney had filed motions to suppress evidence, claiming illegal search and seizure. All motions were denied. Discovery revealed even more than the initial search had uncovered. David had been operating his cash rental scheme since before he'd even married my mother, back when he was just her boyfriend helping manage properties she'd inherited. My father's properties. The ones that were supposed to provide income for his family after his death. David had been stealing from us for over a decade. Helen Yu, the retired accountant who lived 3 houses down from my mother, reached out via email. She'd been watching the situation unfold and had something to share. We met at a coffee shop halfway between San Francisco and Riverside on a Saturday morning when the fog still clung to the highway. Helen was smaller than I remembered, her silver hair cut short, her eyes sharp behind wire-rimmed glasses. She ordered green tea and got straight to business. Your father asked me to watch over the properties before he deployed that last time. Made me promise I'd help your mother manage them if anything happened. She pulled out a worn folder from her bag. David convinced Patricia to let him take over management 6 months after the funeral. Said she was too grief-stricken to handle business matters. I tried to warn her, but she wouldn't listen. I opened the folder. Inside were copies of rental agreements, maintenance records, and financial statements going back 12 years. Helen had been documenting everything. These properties should have been generating $70,000 a year in legitimate rental income. David reported less than 20 on the tax returns and told Patricia the rest went to expenses and repairs. Helen's finger traced down a column of numbers. But look at the actual maintenance costs. Maybe $10,000 annually. The rest went into his pocket. You've been tracking this the entire time? Your father was my friend. His last request was that I protect his family. I failed Patricia, but I wasn't going to fail you. She pushed the folder across the table. Everything's documented. Dates, amounts, discrepancies. I wasn't sure what to do with it until I heard about the investigation. Helen, this is evidence of systematic theft from my mother. Why didn't you tell her? The older woman's face sagged with regret. I tried. Multiple times. But she'd chosen David, chosen to believe his explanations. She accused me of jealousy, of trying to interfere in her marriage. Eventually, she stopped taking my calls. I thought about my mother's capacity for self-deception, her willingness to accept comfortable lies over difficult truths. She's good at not seeing what she doesn't want to see. The heart protects itself in strange ways sometimes. Helen sipped her tea. But Rachel, there's something else. 2 years ago, David tried to get your mother to add his name to the property deeds. Told her it was for estate planning purposes. She refused. It's the only time I ever saw her stand up to him. She kept the properties in her name. All 4 of them. He managed them, he stole from them, but he never owned them. Which means when the courts sort through the asset forfeiture, those properties should revert to Patricia free and clear. They were purchased with your father's money, they're in her name, and while David profited from them illegally, he never actually owned them. Something loosened in my chest. My mother would lose the house, lose the lifestyle David had built, but she wouldn't lose everything. The properties my father had carefully chosen to provide for his family would come back to her. Not worth a fortune, but enough to generate modest income if managed properly. Can you help her? I found myself asking. When this is over, when David's in prison and she's trying to rebuild, could you help her manage the properties the way my father originally intended? Helen's eyes softened. I've been waiting 12 years for that chance. I left the meeting with Helen's documentation safely in my bag in a strange sense of completeness. The pieces were falling into place. David's crimes were documented from multiple angles. My mother would survive financially, if not emotionally. The properties my father had purchased would fulfill their original purpose. James called as I drove back to the city. How did it go with the neighbor? She's been documenting David's theft for 12 years. Turns out my mother owns 4 rental properties free and clear. David stole the income, but he never owned the assets. That's good news, right? It means Mom will be okay. Not comfortable, not the lifestyle she's used to, but okay. She'll have income, a place to start over. And how do you feel about that? I considered the question as the highway stretched ahead, carrying me away from Riverside and everything it represented. Relieved. I wanted David to face consequences, not my mother. She made bad choices, but she doesn't deserve to be destitute. You're more forgiving than I'd be. I'm not forgiving. I'm just distinguishing between enablement and criminality. She enabled him, which was wrong. But she didn't commit fraud. There's a difference. The preliminary hearing arrived with the inevitability of a tidal wave. I took the day off work and drove to Riverside, not to attend the hearing but to be nearby. Jennifer had told me my testimony wouldn't be needed until trial, that the preliminary hearing was just the prosecution demonstrating they had enough evidence to proceed. I parked outside the federal courthouse and watched people come and go. Lawyers in expensive suits. Defendants looking anxious. Families trying to understand how their lives had led them to federal court. Somewhere inside that building, David was learning exactly what 42 counts of federal charges meant. My mother arrived alone, looking diminished in a navy dress I remembered from my father's funeral. She climbed the courthouse steps slowly, like each one required deliberation. I watched her disappear inside and felt a complicated mix of emotions I couldn't quite name. Pity, certainly. Anger, still. But also something approaching sadness for the woman she used to be, the one who'd raised me with clear values before grief and fear had eroded them. Tyler pulled up in a truck I didn't recognize, probably borrowed since David's vehicles had been seized. He looked thinner, older, like the past 3 weeks had aged him years. He saw my car and walked over, jaw set. You came to gloat? I came because this is my family, even if it doesn't feel like it most days. Dad's lawyer says you fabricated evidence. Says you had it out for him because he didn't approve of your engagement. David's lawyer is doing his job, which is creating reasonable doubt. But Tyler, I didn't fabricate anything. The evidence speaks for itself. 12 years of unreported income. Forged signatures using my name. Cash hidden in safety deposit boxes. Those are facts, not fabrications. He took care of us. With stolen money. Tyler, at some point you're going to have to decide whether you want to keep defending a criminal or start building a legitimate life. But that's your choice to make. He stared at me for a long moment, emotions warring across his face. Finally, he walked away without another word, climbing the courthouse steps his father had probably climbed in handcuffs. Jennifer emerged 2 hours later, spotted my car, and walked over. I rolled down the window. Bound over for trial. Judge reviewed the evidence and agreed there's more than sufficient basis for prosecution. We're looking at a trial date sometime in the next 4 months. How did David react? His lawyer tried to paint him as a hard-working businessman being persecuted by a vengeful stepdaughter. The judge was unimpressed. Asked the defense to explain the forged signatures, the hidden cash, the unreported rental income. They had no good answers. And my mother? Jennifer's expression softened. She looked devastated. Left immediately after the hearing. Didn't speak to anyone. I pulled out the folder Helen had given me. These are records of the rental properties my father left to my mother. David's been stealing from them for 12 years, but they're in her name alone. When the asset forfeiture proceedings happen, I need someone to make sure these properties are protected as her separate property. Jennifer took the folder, flipped through it quickly. This is thorough documentation. Who compiled it? A neighbor who promised my father she'd watch over his family. She kept her promise better than anyone else did. I'll make sure the AUSA handling forfeiture sees this. If the properties were purchased before the marriage with your father's life insurance, and David's name was never added to the deeds, they should be protected. She studied me carefully. You're trying to help your mother. I'm trying to ensure she faces appropriate consequences. She enabled David, she chose to believe his lies, but she didn't commit the crimes. She shouldn't lose everything my father left for her. That's generous, considering she watched him hit you. Generosity would be forgetting it happened. This is just fairness. She'll lose the house David bought with illegal funds. She'll lose the lifestyle he provided through theft. But she'll keep what my father intended her to have. That seems proportional. Jennifer nodded slowly. I'll do what I can. For what it's worth, Rachel, you've handled this with more professionalism than most people could manage. I had good training. You taught me that emotions and evidence need to stay separate. After Jennifer left, I sat in my car watching the courthouse. People streamed out as the day's hearings concluded. Lawyers and clients, winners and losers, justice and injustice all mixing together on the steps. This was where David's story would ultimately conclude. Not in his McMansion surrounded by ill-gotten luxury, but in a federal courtroom where numbers mattered more than charm. My phone buzzed. My mother. I answered, unsure what to expect. He's going to prison. Her voice was hollow, defeated. His lawyer says even if we win some motions, the evidence is overwhelming. 20 years, minimum. Yes. Probably. The prosecutor mentioned your name. Said you reported the crimes, provided initial evidence. Everyone knows now. Everyone knows my daughter destroyed my husband. Your husband destroyed himself, Mom. I just documented it. How can you be so cold? Don't you feel anything? I thought about the question. Did I feel anything? Satisfaction? Vindication? Relief? All of those and none of them. Mostly I felt tired. I feel sad that you married a criminal. I feel angry that he stole from you for 12 years. I feel frustrated that you're blaming me instead of him. But mostly, Mom, I feel like I did my job. I'm a federal agent. I found evidence of crimes. I reported them. That's not cold, that's professional responsibility. He loved me in his way. His way involved stealing your inheritance and using your daughter's name to commit fraud. That's not love, Mom. That's exploitation disguised as provision. Silence stretched between us, years of unspoken disappointments and divergent values creating a canyon too wide to bridge with a phone call. Helen, you contacted me, my mother finally said. She has records of the rental properties. Says she wants to help me manage them properly. You should let her. She's been trying to help you for 12 years. Maybe it's time to listen. Will you help me find an apartment? For after everything. The question hung in the air, weighted with all the complicated history between us. Part of me wanted to refuse, to let her figure it out alone the way she'd let me figure out so much alone. But another part, the part that remembered her before David, before grief broke her, that part won. Yes. I'll help you find a place. Something modest, near the properties so you can manage them. But Mom, I need you to understand something. I'll help you rebuild a simple, honest life. I won't help you recreate the illusion David provided. Those days are over. I know. Her voice cracked. I've known for a while now. I just didn't want to admit it. Admission is the first step. After hanging up, I started the car and headed back toward San Francisco. In my rearview mirror, Riverside disappeared, the courthouse shrinking to a speck. Behind me lay years of dysfunction, enabling, and crime. Ahead lay whatever came next. A trial. A conviction, almost certainly. A prison sentence. My mother rebuilding from ruins. Tyler learning to work for honest money. Helen finally able to keep her promise to my father. And me, driving back to a life I'd built on integrity, wearing a ring that represented real value, engaged to a man who measured worth in character rather than currency. David had called that ring garbage. He'd hit me for defending it. He'd set in motion the very investigation that would destroy everything he'd built. The irony was almost poetic. He'd taught me that violence established dominance. Instead, I'd shown him that documentation defeated deception. He believed money bought immunity. I'd proven that everyone faced the same laws. He'd thought family loyalty meant silence. I'd demonstrated that real loyalty meant refusing to enable wrongdoing. Traffic thickened as I approached the city, thousands of people heading home after honest days of work, paying their taxes, following rules, living within their means. Normal people David had considered beneath him. People who'd never face federal charges because they understood what he'd refused to learn. Some rules couldn't be broken without consequences, no matter how clever you thought you were, no matter how much money you hid, no matter how many people you intimidated into silence. David Brennan was learning that lesson in federal detention. Soon he'd learn it in federal prison. And somewhere in Riverside, my mother was beginning to understand that the life she'd been living was built on sand, impressive to look at but destined to collapse the moment someone looked too closely. I'd been that someone. The daughter who'd come home to share joy and found violence instead. The federal agent who'd looked closely at the numbers and found systematic fraud. The woman who'd valued a modest sapphire over expensive displays and triggered an avalanche of consequences. The ring caught the late afternoon sun as I drove, throwing tiny rainbows across the dashboard. Worth more than everything David had ever owned, measured by the currency that actually mattered. Truth, integrity, and the courage to demand both from everyone, including family. The trial began on a Tuesday morning in October, 6 months after the dinner that had changed everything. I sat in the back row of the federal courtroom, dressed in a charcoal suit, watching jury selection with the detached interest of someone who testified in dozens of similar proceedings but never for a case this personal. David sat at the defense table in an ill-fitting suit, the weight loss from 6 months in detention evident in the way his clothes hung. His attorney, Gerald Morrison, was exactly what money could buy: silver-haired, expensive shoes, the kind of practice charm that worked in boardrooms but often fell flat in federal court. Tyler sat directly behind his father, loyal to the end. My mother was notably absent. Jennifer caught my eye from the prosecution table and gave a slight nod. She'd prepared me for this moment, warned me that seeing David in court might trigger unexpected emotions. But I felt nothing beyond professional curiosity about how the defense would attempt to explain 12 years of documented fraud. The jury was seated by afternoon. 7 women, 5 men. A retired teacher, 2 engineers, a nurse, a small business owner, a librarian, a construction foreman. People who paid their taxes, followed rules, lived honest lives. They would decide David's fate based on numbers that didn't lie and documents that told their own story. Opening statements began the next morning. The assistant U.S. attorney, Catherine Webb, stood before the jury with the quiet confidence of someone holding irrefutable evidence. She walked them through the timeline methodically. David meeting Patricia Morrison, a widow with 4 rental properties purchased through her late husband's life insurance. David offering to manage those properties. David systematically stealing rental income for over a decade while reporting minimal earnings. David creating shell companies using his stepdaughter's forged signature to launder money. David hiding cash in safety deposit boxes while claiming poverty. David building a lifestyle on theft and calling it business. The defendant didn't just evade taxes, Catherine said, her voice carrying clearly through the courtroom. He built an empire on systematic fraud. And when his stepdaughter, a federal agent, discovered his crimes, he attempted to destroy evidence and intimidate witnesses. This isn't a case about complicated business decisions or good faith mistakes. This is a case about a man who believed rules didn't apply to him and spent 12 years proving it. Gerald Morrison's opening was predictable. David was a hard-working businessman. The tax code was impossibly complex. Record-keeping mistakes weren't crimes. His stepdaughter had orchestrated this prosecution out of spite after a family disagreement. The forged signatures were a misunderstanding. The cash was savings. The unreported income was an oversight that could be corrected with penalties and interest, not prison time. I watched the jury's faces as Morrison spoke. They weren't buying it. Numbers didn't care about charm, and the evidence was overwhelming. My testimony came on day 3. I took the stand, stated my name and occupation, and watched David's face as I described finding his office files, discovering my forged signature on corporate documents, recognizing the structured fraud patterns I'd been trained to identify. His attorney tried to paint me as vindictive, asked repeatedly about the dinner incident, suggested I'd fabricated evidence to punish David for criticizing my engagement ring. "Mr. Morrison," I said calmly when he'd finished his implication, "I discovered your client's crimes by accident. I reported them because I'm a federal agent and that's my legal obligation. The fact that he also physically assaulted me that evening is documented separately but doesn't change the evidence of fraud. The numbers speak for themselves. But you had a motive to lie. I had a motive to be thorough. Which is why every piece of evidence was independently verified by agents who have no personal connection to this case. The forged signatures were analyzed by handwriting experts. The financial records were audited by forensic accountants. The properties were verified by county records. Nothing I reported depends on my word alone." Jennifer's redirect was brief. She had me walk through my qualifications, my training in identifying financial fraud, my professional reputation. Then she asked the question that mattered. "Special Agent Morrison, in your professional opinion, was this fraud sophisticated or simple?" "Simple. Textbook evasion tactics." The defendant documented his own crimes in handwritten ledgers. He hid cash in obvious places. He used his stepdaughter's name without considering she was a federal agent who would eventually notice. This wasn't sophisticated. It was arrogant. The trial lasted 2 weeks. "Helen, you testified about the properties and David's systematic theft. The forensic accountant detailed the unreported income year by year. The handwriting expert showed slide after slide comparing my signature to the forgeries. Bank employees testified about the safety deposit box filled with cash. David's own tenants, immigrants who'd paid rent in cash and been threatened with deportation if they complained, described a man who'd exploited their vulnerability for profit. David never took the stand. His attorney knew that cross-examination would destroy whatever remained of his defense. Closing arguments arrived with the inevitability of mathematics. Catherine Webb stood before the jury and simply reviewed the numbers. 1.4 million in unreported income. 42 separate counts of fraud. 12 years of systematic crime. Evidence that couldn't be explained away or dismissed. "The defendant wants you to believe this was complicated business practice," Catherine said. But it wasn't. He saw money that didn't belong to him and took it. He saw rules that applied to everyone else and ignored them. He saw his stepdaughter's professional reputation and used it to commit crimes. Simple theft, repeated over and over until someone finally looked closely enough to notice. The jury deliberated for 6 hours. I spent that time in a coffee shop 3 blocks from the courthouse, reviewing case files for other investigations, maintaining the professional distance that had carried me through these months. Jennifer texted updates. They'd requested financial records twice. They'd asked for clarification on the forged signature evidence. They'd reviewed the ledgers. The verdict came at 4:30. Guilty on all 42 counts. I wasn't in the courtroom when they read it. Jennifer called immediately afterward, her voice carrying satisfaction and exhaustion in equal measure. Unanimous on every count. The judge thanked the jury for their careful attention to complex financial evidence. Sentencing is scheduled for 8 weeks from now. How did David react? No visible emotion until they led him away. Then he looked at Tyler and mouthed, "I'm sorry." Tyler was crying. And my mother? Still wasn't there. "Rachel, I know this is complicated for you, but you should know that what you did here matters. Not just for your family, but for everyone he exploited. Those tenants who testified, they'll get restitution. Your mother will keep the properties your father intended for her. Justice happened because you refused to look away." After hanging up, I sat with my coffee and watched the city move around me. People heading home from work, starting evening shifts, living their ordinary lives. David would spend the next 20 years in federal prison, away from all of this. His empire was already being dismantled, properties sold at auction, proceeds going to pay restitution and fines. James met me for dinner at a quiet restaurant where nobody knew us and the news hadn't yet spread. He held my hand across the table and asked the question he'd been avoiding for months. "How do you feel?" I looked at the ring on my finger, the sapphire that had started everything, and thought about the question. How did I feel? Relieved that it was over. Sad about the waste of it all. Grateful that justice had functioned as designed. Tired from months of maintaining professional boundaries while my family imploded. I feel like I did the right thing, even though the right thing hurt people I care about. I feel like my father would be proud, even though his widow won't speak to me. I feel like this ring is still the most valuable thing I own, even though it caused so much trouble. The ring didn't cause anything. I know. But it revealed everything, which might be more important. Sentencing came on a gray December morning. The judge, a woman in her 60s who'd presided over hundreds of financial crime cases, reviewed the pre-sentence report with visible displeasure. David's lack of remorse. His attempts to blame others. His continued insistence that he'd done nothing wrong. "Mr. Brennan," she said, looking down at him from the bench, "you had every advantage. A comfortable life. A family. Legitimate income from property management that could have provided well if managed honestly. Instead, you chose to steal from your tenants, defraud the government, and forge your stepdaughter's signature to facilitate your crimes. You showed no mercy to those you exploited and no remorse when caught." She sentenced him to 22 years in federal prison, the high end of the guidelines. Restitution of $1.6 million. Forfeiture of all assets purchased with illegal proceeds. Supervised release for 5 years after prison, though at his age, that would likely be academic. David's face remained blank as they led him away. Tyler followed the marshals with his eyes, then turned to look directly at me in the gallery. Our eyes met. He didn't look angry anymore. Just lost. My mother appeared outside the courthouse as I was leaving. She looked smaller, older, dressed in clothes I didn't recognize. Simple, inexpensive, the wardrobe of someone rebuilding on a budget. "Rachel." "Mom." We stood facing each other, months of silence and thousands of unspoken words creating an awkward gap neither knew how to bridge. "Helen helped me find an apartment. Near the properties. I'm managing them myself now, the way I should have years ago." "That's good. I wanted you to know that I told the truth during my deposition. About not knowing about the crimes. About David controlling everything. About being afraid." She paused, gathering courage. "And about you. I told them you tried to warn me years ago. That you offered to help me leave. That I chose to stay because I was scared of being alone. I know. Jennifer told me. I'm sorry I wasn't in the courtroom. I couldn't face seeing him sentenced. Couldn't face the cameras, the reporters asking if I knew my husband was a criminal. You don't owe me explanations, Mom. Yes, I do. Her voice strengthened slightly. I owe you more than I can ever repay. You tried to help me and I chose him. You reported his crimes and I blamed you. You offered me a fresh start and I called you cold. I was wrong about everything. I looked at this woman who'd raised me, who'd taught me right from wrong before grief eroded her judgment, who was finally choosing courage over comfort even though it came too late to save anything. You're managing the properties honestly now? Helen checks my books every month. I pay every dollar of tax I owe. I live in a 2-bedroom apartment and drive a used car. It's not the life David gave me, but it's clean. Clean matters more than comfortable. Your father used to say that. Her eyes filled with tears. I forgot for a while. I'm trying to remember now. We stood in awkward silence until she pulled out a small envelope and handed it to me. This came in the mail last week. From the Military Records Department. Your father's medals. The ones David said he'd lost. He'd sold them to a collector. The government tracked them down and returned them to me as next of kin. I want you to have them. I opened the envelope carefully. Bronze Star. Purple Heart. Combat Action Badge. The weight of my father's service, his sacrifice, his legacy. David had stolen these and sold them like scrap metal. Thank you. Will you come to dinner sometime? Just you and James? Nothing fancy. Just family, or what's left of it. I thought about the question. Could we rebuild something from the ruins? Could I forgive her weakness even if I couldn't forget it? Could she become the mother she'd been before David, or at least someone trying to be? Maybe. When I'm ready. But Mom, if I come, it has to be honest. No pretending the past didn't happen. No excusing David's crimes or my role in exposing them. Just the truth, even when it's uncomfortable. I understand. The truth, even when it hurts. Especially when it hurts. She walked away slowly, shoulders straight despite the burden of shame she'd carry forever. I watched her disappear into the crowd and felt something shift inside me. Not forgiveness exactly, but perhaps the beginning of understanding. She'd made terrible choices, but she was trying to make better ones now. That had to count for something. James found me standing on the courthouse steps, my father's medals in one hand, my phone in the other. Ready to go home? I looked at him, this good man who measured worth in character, who'd given me his grandmother's ring and never once questioned my decisions, who'd stood beside me through 6 months of family destruction without complaint. Yes. Let's go home. We drove back to San Francisco through winter rain, the city lights blurred and softened by water on the windshield. Somewhere behind us, David began his first day of a 22-year sentence. Somewhere in Riverside, my mother was learning to live honestly for the first time in years. Somewhere Tyler was figuring out how to build a legitimate career without his father's criminal support. And here, in this car with this man, wearing this ring that had revealed everything, I was finally free. Free from the burden of family secrets. Free from the weight of enabling dysfunction. Free to build a life based on the values my father had died defending. Truth. Honor. Integrity. The willingness to do what was right even when it cost everything. The ring caught the dashboard lights, sapphire glowing softly in the darkness. David had called it garbage, had hit me for defending it, had set in motion his own destruction by underestimating what it represented. Real value. The kind that couldn't be bought or stolen or forged. The kind that came from choosing substance over show, from refusing to compromise principles for comfort, from understanding that some things mattered more than money or status or family loyalty. James reached over and took my hand, his thumb brushing the sapphire. Your grandmother would have loved today, I said quietly. She would have loved you. Fierce and honest and uncompromising. Is that what I am? That's exactly what you are. It's why I love you. It's why this ring fits you perfectly. We drove through the rain-soaked streets toward our apartment, our life, our future built on honesty and hard work and the courage to demand better from ourselves and everyone around us. Behind us lay wreckage and consequences and justice served. Ahead lay whatever we chose to build, one truthful day at a time. The sapphire sparkled on my finger, modest and meaningful and absolutely perfect. Worth more than all of David's fraud combined, measured by the only currency that actually mattered. The truth, no matter the cost. The right thing, no matter who it hurt. Justice, even when it destroyed a family to deliver it. I'd come home to share joy and found violence instead. I'd discovered crimes and reported them. I'd watched a family implode and refused to stop the collapse by lying. Some people would call that cold. Others might call it principled. I called it necessary. Because without consequences, rules were just suggestions. Without accountability, crimes were just business. Without someone willing to document the truth, fraud was just success. David had taught me that lesson better than he'd ever intended. And now he had 22 years in federal prison to reflect on what happened when you hit the wrong person over the wrong ring. Up next, you've got 2 more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out.